Alina Vance was a woman defined by her boundaries. At 42, she was the keeper of the ancestral home in Oak Haven, a sprawling, slightly decaying Victorian relic tucked away in a humid river valley. She was a botanical illustrator, a profession that suited her temperament perfectly. It required patience, solitude, and an obsessive attention to the smallest details, the delicate veining of a petal, the precise serration of a leaf. It was a life lived under glass, much like the specimens she studied. Her family, a boisterous, demanding clan scattered across 3 states, viewed Alina as the foundational stone. She was the sensible one, the aunt who remembered birthdays, the sister who mediated disputes, the daughter who had stayed behind to nurse their parents through their final, long illnesses. She was reliable, constant, and entirely unexciting. She had accepted this role like a heavy winter coat, wearing it regardless of the season, until she forgot what her own skin felt like underneath. But this summer was unusually hot. The air in the valley was thick enough to taste, heavy with the scent of river mud and blooming jasmine, and perhaps it was the heat that stirred something dormant in Alina's blood. On a Tuesday that should have been like any other, Alina found herself in a small boutique in the next town over, a place she never shopped. She was there to buy sensible linen trousers. Instead, she left with a dress. It was emerald green silk, sleeveless, with a neckline that plunged just enough to feel dangerous, and a skirt that whispered against her legs when she moved. For 3 days, the dress hung on the outside of her wardrobe door, accusing her. It was a mistake. It was a costume for a woman she wasn't. Yet, on Friday evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the ridge, casting long violet shadows across the overgrown lawn, Alina showered and, with a trembling hand, reached for the silk. Standing before the tarnished cheval mirror in her bedroom, she didn't recognize the reflection. The woman staring back wasn't the sensible aunt. Her collarbones were sharp and elegant. Her arms, usually hidden by cardigans, were toned from years of gardening. The emerald color made her hazel eyes snap with an unfamiliar intensity. She felt exposed, ridiculous, and utterly exhilarated. She went downstairs, the old wood creaking under her wedges shoes that still had the price tag on the sole. She poured herself a glass of iced tea laced with mint from her garden and stepped onto the wide veranda. The air was cooling slightly, the cicadas beginning their nightly sonic assault. She intended to sit for 10 minutes, feel the breeze on her bare shoulders, and then change back into her house dress before her nephew arrived. Julian was due that evening. At 24, he had just finished a grueling 5-year architecture program and was drifting, burnt out, before starting a hypersure job in the city in the fall. He had offered to spend a month at the estate, ostensibly to renovate the derelict greenhouse at the bottom of the garden in exchange for room and board. Alina still pictured Julian as a lanky teenager obsessed with sketching charcoal buildings, a quiet boy who often hid in her library during loud family gatherings. She expected that boy to step out of the car. The crunch of gravel on the winding driveway announced his arrival earlier than planned. A battered SUV pulled up to the portico. The engine cut, and the door opened. The man who stepped out was not the boy she remembered. Julian had filled out. The gangly limbs of adolescence had hardened into broad shoulders and lean muscle, evident beneath a dust-covered t-shirt. His jaw was defined, covered in a few days of dark stubble, and he moved with a weary, deliberate grace that spoke of exhaustion. He slung a duffel bag over his shoulder and looked up at the veranda. He stopped dead. His eyes, a striking slate blue, inherited from his mother, didn't just glance at Alina. They arrested. They widened, taking in the emerald dress, the bare arms, the wedges. It wasn't a lecherous look. It was something far more disarming. It was a look of total, unfiltered surprise, followed by an intense, almost painful curiosity. Alina felt a blush rise from her chest to her hairline. The silk suddenly felt too thin. She fought the urge to cross her arms over her chest. Alina. Julian's voice was deeper than she recalled, roughened by travel. He didn't say Aunt Alina. Julian. She managed, her voice tighter than she intended. You made good time. I wasn't expecting you for another hour. He walked slowly up the veranda steps, dropping his bag. He didn't stop looking at her, his expression a complicated mix of familiarity and sudden strangeness. Yeah. Beat the refinery traffic. He paused on the top step, the air between them suddenly thick with unsaid things. You look incredible. The compliment landed heavily. It wasn't the polite you look nice of family gatherings. It was direct, man to woman, and it stripped Alina of her usual poise. Oh, this old thing, she lied, waving a dismissive hand and nearly spilling her tea. Just trying to stay cool in this humidity. You must be exhausted. Come in. I have cold supper waiting. She turned and fled into the house, painfully aware of the sway of the silk skirt and the eyes following her every move. The kitchen was large, high-ceilinged, and dominated by a massive oak table that could seat 20. Tonight, it was set for 2 at one end. Alina had prepared a cold roasted chicken, potato salad, and sliced heirloom tomatoes from her garden. Simple, summer fare. They ate in a silence that felt louder than the cicadas outside. Julian seemed content to just breathe the stillness of the house, but his eyes kept drifting back to her across the table. Every time she caught his gaze, he didn't look away immediately. He held it for a beat too long, making her heart perform an anxious, irregular rhythm against her ribs. How is your mother? Alina asked, desperate to return to safe, familial ground. Julian grimaced slightly, as he served himself more tomatoes. Intense. She's already planning my wedding to a girl I haven't met yet, and I haven't even started the new job. I needed to escape the itinerary she has planned for my life. Alina smiled, a genuine, weary empathy surfacing. Carolyn has always enjoyed planning other people's lives. She means well, does she? Julian questioned, his tone dry. He looked at Alina, really studied her. You escaped it, mostly, by staying here. I didn't escape, Alina corrected gently. I just chose a different kind of duty. Someone had to look after the house, and Mom and Dad. Julian went quiet. He stopped eating and leaned back in his chair, one arm resting on the table. His hand was large, long-fingered on architect's hand. Yeah, you did the heavy lifting. As usual. The acknowledgement was unexpected. Usually, the family took her presence here for granted. It was fine, Julian. It was what was needed. That's what you always say. He reached for his water glass, and his hand brushed hers where it rested on the tablecloth. It was the barest of touches. A grazing of skin. Yet Alina felt a jolt of electricity shoot up her arm so sharp she almost gasped. She froze, staring at their hands, which were now inches apart. Julian didn't pull back instantly. He let his hand hover near hers for a second that stretched into an eternity, the air vibrating between them. Then slowly, he withdrew his hand and took a drink. When he lowered the glass, his eyes were softer, darker. You seem different tonight, Alina, he said quietly. She forced a bright, brittle laugh. Different? I'm just older, Julian. For years is a long time. He shook his head slowly, his gaze pinning her. No, it's not that. You seem lighter, like you're not holding the roof up for 5 minutes. Elena's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond to being truly seen, especially by someone who wasn't supposed to see her at all. I'm tired, she stated abruptly, standing up to clear the plates. And you must be too. We can discuss the greenhouse in the morning. She escaped to the kitchen sink, running the water loudly to drown out the hammering of her own heart. When Alina woke the next morning, the emerald dress lay in a heap on her floor like a shed skin. The previous night felt like a fever dream, the humidity, the silk, the look in Julian's eyes. Reality reasserted itself with the morning sun. She was 42. He was her nephew. The very thought of the tension she'd felt was absurd, bordering on grotesque. She needed to reset the dynamic immediately. She dressed in her usual armor, oversized, beige linen overalls and a faded t-shirt that hid her shape completely. She pulled her hair back into a severe, practical knot. When she looked in the mirror, the sensible aunt stared back. Good, she found Julian already outside, standing before the ruin of the greenhouse. It was a large, Victorian structure of iron and glass, neglected for 15 years. Ivy had choked out the light, several panes were shattered, and the interior was a jungle of aggressive weeds. Julian was wearing work boots, jeans, and a t-shirt already damp with sweat in the oppressive morning heat. He was sketching on a pad, his brow furrowed in concentration. Morning, Alina called out, her voice brisk and efficient. It's a disaster, isn't it? I almost told you not to bother. Julian looked up from his sketch pad. He took in the overalls, the tight hair. A small, knowing smile tugged at the corner of his mouth that infuriated Alina. Morning, he replied easily. It's got good bones. Just needs to be cleared out so we can see what we're dealing with. I'm going to need an extra pair of hands to haul the vines out, unless you have pressing botanical illustrations to do. Alina hesitated. Her studio was her sanctuary, but the challenge in his eyes made her stubborn. I can spare the morning. The next 4 hours were brutal. The heat inside the glass structure was intense, a humid green oven. They worked mostly in silence, ripping down decades of thick, dusty ivy, wrestling with brambles that snagged their clothes and skin. Alina worked with a fury. channeling her anxiety into manual labor. She hated that she was hyper-aware of Julian's presence in the confined space. She hated that she noticed the way his back muscles bunched when he leveraged a heavy root from the ground, or the scent of his sweat clean and sharp mixing with the smell of crushed earth and tomato vines. By noon, they were both drenched and filthy. Alina called a halt. She sat on an overturned crate, wiping dirt and sweat from her face with the back of her gloved hand. Her hair had escaped its knot and hung in damp tendrils around her face. Julian leaned against a support beam opposite her, drinking from a water bottle. He was breathing hard, his t-shirt clinging to him. He looked at her, disheveled and dirty in her oversized overalls, with the same intensity he had looked at her in the silk dress. "You know," he said, catching his breath, "you can wear the overalls, Alina. You can tie your hair back until your scalp hurts. But it doesn't change what I saw last night." Alina stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about. I dressed up for dinner, that's all." Julian pushed off the beam and took a step closer. The air in the greenhouse suddenly felt too thin to breathe. "Why are you so afraid of being noticed?" he asked gently. "You've spent your whole life making sure everyone else is okay, making sure you're the background noise so they can shine. Why is it so terrifying to take center stage for one night?" "You're projecting, Julian. This is about you and your mother, not me, isn't it?" He crouched down so they were eye level. "I remember when I was 10, and Grandpa was dying up in the east bedroom. The whole house was chaos. Mom was crying in the kitchen, uncles were arguing about money in the den, and you were just walking between the rooms, bringing tea, quieting people down, absorbing the grief so no one else had to drown in it. I saw you then, Alina, and I see you now. You're still doing it." Alina felt a stinging prick of tears. She blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of him, not in baggy overalls in a dirty greenhouse. "It's just who I am," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Julian said firmly. "It's what you do. It's not who you are. Who you are is the woman who bought that green dress because she's starving to feel something real." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She stood up abruptly, knocking over the crate. "I need to go inside. Lunch," she choked out, fleeing the greenhouse for the second time in 24 hours. Over the next week, a strange rhythm developed. They worked on the greenhouse every morning. The physical labor became a kind of dialogue. They learned how to move around each other in the tight space, anticipating each other's nitsa, handed tool, a shared water bottle without speaking. The tension didn't dissipate, it changed shape. It became a heavy, humid pressure, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Alina found herself unable to retreat fully into her sensibly aunt persona. The armor had cracks. She started leaving her hair down in the evenings. One night, she wore a blouse that was slightly sheer, small rebellions against her own history. Julian, for his part, seemed to be waging a quiet war against her solitude. He coaxed her into talking about her work, genuinely fascinated by the microscopic details she obsessed over. He engaged her in debates about books, politics, things no one in her family ever bothered to ask her opinion on. He was treating her not as an aunt, but as a contemporary, an equal, and it was intoxicating. Then came the night of the storm. It had been building all day, the sky turning a bruised purple, the air stagnant and heavy. When it finally broke around 7 in the evening, it was violent. Thunder shook the foundations of the old house, and rain lashed against the windows in sheets. The power went out immediately, plunging the house into premature darkness. Alina found candles in the pantry and lit them in the kitchen. She and Julian sat at the smaller island counter, eating sandwiches by flickering candlelight, the storm raging outside. The intimacy of the small circle of light was intense. Julian watched the flame dancing on a candle wick. "I love this house," he murmured. "It feels like it's holding its breath." "It feels heavy to me sometimes," Alina admitted, the darkness making her brave, full of ghosts, expectations. "Like the expectation that you'll stay here forever, guarding the shrine." Alina swirled her wine in her glass. "Someone has to." "Why? Sell it, travel, get a studio in the city where you can actually meet people." "It's not that simple, Julian. My life is here. My work is here. Your rut is here," he corrected softly. He reached across the counter, but this time, he didn't just brush her hand. He covered it with his own. His palm was warm, rough from the greenhouse work. Alina stopped breathing. She stared at his hand covering hers. It felt profoundly right, and utterly forbidden. "Alina," he said, his voice low, barely audible over the drumming rain. "Stop hiding, please." She looked up, meeting his slate blue eyes in the candlelight. The longing there was naked, terrifying. Julian, we can't, she whispered, but she didn't pull her hand away. You're my nephew. It's impossible, is it? His thumb began to stroke the side of her hand, a slow hypnotic rhythm that sent shivers down her spine. Because right now, sitting here with you, nothing has ever felt more possible. The rest of the world, the labels, the family trees, it all feels like noise. This feels real. You're confused. You're in a transition period. You're vulnerable, and I'm just here. I'm the nearest port in a storm. Don't insult me, Alina, and don't lie to yourself. This has been happening since the second I got out of the car. Maybe before. He stood up slowly and walked around the island. He stopped inches from her chair. She looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He reached down and gently took her chin in his hand, tilting her face up. His touch was reverence, not aggression. Tell me to stop, he whispered, leaning closer. His breath was warm on her cheek. Tell me you don't feel this pull. Tell me, I'm imagining it. And I will walk away right now and never mention it again. Alina opened her mouth to say the words. Stop, you're imagining it. They were the safe words, the sensible words, but she couldn't say them. Because he wasn't imagining it. The pull was visceral, a tidal force dragging her toward him. Instead of speaking, a small choked sound escaped her throat, a sob of wanting. Julian took that as his answer. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative testing kiss. It was a collision. Years of repression met years of unvoiced longing. It was hungry and desperate. Alina remained frozen for half a second, her mind screaming wrong, 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 while her body screamed finally. Then, she broke. She stood up, meeting him, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming urgent. It was a release of everything she had held in check for decades, the loneliness, the desire, the sheer need to be touched, held, wanted. 4 minutes. They stood in the kitchen, lit only by lightning flashes and candles, lost in the storm between them. Then, reality crashed back in. Alina gasped and pulled away, stumbling back against the counter. Her chest was heaving, her lips swollen. She stared at Julian in horror. Oh my God, she whispered. What have we done? Julian was breathing hard, his eyes dark and dilated. He reached for her again. Elena, no! She put a hand out to stop him. No. Julian, this is madness. You have to. I can't. Panic seized her. The weight of the taboo, the potential destruction of her family relationships, the sheer age difference, it all crashed down on her. Without another word, she snatched one of the candlesticks and fled the kitchen, running up the stairs to her room, locking the door behind her as if that could lock out what had just happened. She didn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the storm die out, her body humming with residual adrenaline and a terrifying, unfamiliar joy that warred with crushing guilt. The next morning, the house was silent. The air was scrubbed clean by the storm, cool and clear. Alina came downstairs early, dreading the encounter. She found Julian in the kitchen, packed duffel bag at his feet. He was drinking coffee, looking out the window at the rain-slicked garden. He turned when he heard her enter. His face was drawn, tired, but his eyes were clear. I'm leaving, he said quietly. Relief and agonizing disappointment crashed into Alina simultaneously. Where will you go? Back to the city, a friend's couch until the new lease starts. The greenhouse isn't finished. He gave a dry, humorless laugh. The greenhouse was never the point, Alina. He walked over to where she stood by the doorway. He didn't try to touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel his warmth. I'm not sorry, he said firmly. I won't apologize for kissing you, or for wanting you. Julian, please. It's just too complicated. The family that uses you up and takes you for granted. He shook his head. You're hiding behind them again. Alina, you're using duty as a shield because you're scared to death of actually living your own life. Maybe I am, she cried softly. Maybe I like my safe life. Maybe I'm too old to blow everything up for a summer fling. Julian flinched. Is that what you think this is? A fling? What else could it be? You're 24, Julian. You're just starting your life. I'm 20. I'm set in mine. It would never work. It's a fantasy. He looked at her for a long, agonizing moment, a profound sadness settling over his features. You know, he said softly, I think the bravest thing you ever did was buy that green dress. The saddest thing you'll ever do is let it hang in the closet for the rest of your life. He picked up his bag. Goodbye, Alina. He walked out the front door. She watched him get into his SUV, watched it drive down the winding gravel path until it disappeared around the bend. Alina stood alone in the silent hallway of the big, empty house. She went into the kitchen, The 2 coffee cups were still on the counter. The air still felt charged with his presence. She walked through the house, room by room. The library, where she hid. The parlor, where she served tea to relatives who didn't ask how she was. The studio where she drew dead plants under glass. It all looked different now. It didn't look safe. It looked suffocating. Julian was gone. The impossibility of them was real. He was right to leave. It could never have been more than a moment out of time. But he was also right about something else. Alina went upstairs to her bedroom. She opened the wardrobe. The emerald silk dress hung there, vibrant against the drab wool and linen. She took it off the hanger. She didn't put it on. Instead, she laid it on the bed. Then she pulled out a suitcase from the back of the closet, a suitcase that hadn't been used in a decade. She began to pack. Not for a holiday. For a life. She didn't know where she was going yet. Maybe just to the city for a month. Maybe to a coastline she'd only ever seen in pictures. She sat at her desk and penned a letter to her sister Caroline. It was brief. It explained that she was taking an indefinite leave of absence from managing the estate, that they would need to hire a caretaker, that she was uncontactable for the time being. She sealed the letter, feeling a terrifying lightness spread through her chest. It was the sensation of a heavy coat being shed after a very long winter. She carried her suitcase downstairs, the old wood creaking under her feet. She left the letter on the hall table where it couldn't be missed. Alina Vance walked out onto the veranda, locking the heavy oak front door behind her. She didn't look back at the house that had been her sanctuary and her prison. She looked toward the driveway, toward the road, toward the terrifying wide-open world. She was alone. Her heart was aching with a confusing mix of loss for what couldn't be, and gratitude for what had been awakened. Julian was gone, but the woman he had seen, the woman in the green silk, was finally stepping into the light.